The table saw is the go-to machine for clean cuts thanks to its sharp carbide teeth and precise blade curve. But it does have its limitations, specifically the arc of the blade. For example, if I need to cut 3 inches into a board and stop, I'm left with an arc instead of a clean edge. While sleds can help by allowing us to stand the stock upright, they're often bulky and tricky to use for precise sideway cuts. That's where a tenoning jig comes in. Let me show you how to build one that's compact, precise, and versatile for cuts like these. This is an onion project, which means there are multiple build layers to it. In the first half of this video, I'll show you how to build a fully functional jig that's ready to use. But if you stay until the end, you'll see some extra features that can take your jig to the next level. Let's get started. To make this part of the project, we'll be using plywood, and I think that this is probably about, 32, 34 inches in all in length by 8 inches. All the dimensions are going to be on the website, but there's really not a lot of plywood here to do this. We will be using T-track, which will help to lock everything in place. I will be using a U-bolt as a clamp, and I'll show you more about how I do that later on. You could just use a wide F-clamp to clamp your stock to the vertical wall, but I'm going to try to do something a little bit different, and we'll see what we come up with. I think one of the more interesting things that I'm going to do is use dowel rods to line everything up, that top plate with the bottom. I am going to use steel dowels. These have a zinc coating on them, but you could use wood dowels if you want to. I just think that the steel dowels will work better because they won't expand and contract in time. So let's go ahead and get started with this part of the project. If you check my material list on the website, you'll see that I'm using one long piece here, and then these 2 pieces are going to act as something else altogether. But I want to cut my grooves in this before I split it into 2 sections. So right now, that's what we're going to do. The first thing we'll need to do is set this to 3/16 of an inch. And it really needs to be right on 3/16 of an inch. Now I need to set this to 2 3/8, so I'm going to come in here, find the 2 3/8. I want to make a cut, flip my board, and make another cut. And I'm going to keep moving my fence until I'm 2 inches away from the blade. And as you can see, I am just barely touching, and that's what I want. Now I need to mark this at 12 inches, which is where I'm going to make my cut. The smaller piece, I'll set my fence to 6.5 inches, and we'll cut off either side. It doesn't really matter which side. Now, with this piece cut to size, we can set this off to the side, and we've got our fence piece now that we also need to cut to size as well. We're not done with the larger piece. We're going to cut a track down the center of it that our T-track will fit into. That means I need to raise my blade to 3/8 or lower it to 3/8 of an inch. And I'll find the approximate center of this. It really doesn't matter that it's exact. That's what I really love about being able to flip this back and forth and cutting both sides, is that you're going to find the center no matter what you do. And here we go. The track's in place and we can move on. I've got my track in here, and you can see that I've got a little bit of play. I'm going to fix it with a toothpick. I'll just break it in half, and I'm going to pin it to one side like this. I need to drill these out and add number 6 by 1/2 inch screws. So I'm going to use a countersink bit to do that. And there we go. We're going to flip it over now, and we're going to check the bottom side. And just as I thought, it looks like it might be poking through or just right at the surface. I'm just getting a little bit of it off. Okay, I've cut my steel dowels. You really only need a hacksaw to do this. You don't need to go out and buy a grinder. The carriage will sit on top of it, and it slides back and forth like this. If you look at it from the side, it's really simple, and if you do it just right, you'll have a little bit of a gap. But if I take this off, you can see how absolutely important this is, that these do not have any side-to-side play. With the way that I have it now, there is no twist. It's absolutely flat, and it'll slide really well for what I want it to do. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to find out where the T-bolt needs to be able to fit in here. I'll set this back on here. I'm going to slide this to one end. And now I need to find the center of my track here, which looks like it's going to be right about there. Now I need to find the center of my stock and drill a hole out at that marking. I've transferred my line to the top here, and I'm just going to draw a line across. I'm a little bit over 10 inches, so I'm just going to go down to 5. That should be fine. And that's where I want to drill my 5/16 hole. Now I can add my bolt. And there we go. That's not going to move anywhere. Now we need to do something with this that will allow us to move it vertically back and forth. And of course, we're going to go with the miter slot. So let's do that now. To use this with the miter slot, there's two different options you can go with. You can use the miter gauge, or you can use a miter bar that will fit inside the slot. Well, I'm going to be using my miter gauge for my project because I'm happy with how accurate it is inside the miter slot. If you have one that has any kind of play, you'll want to make a bar instead that will fit inside the slot. I will show you how you can do it with a sled, but first I'm going to show you how to do it with a miter gauge. The piece that we cut off earlier is going to fit on the side like this, right next to our cradle base. You also need to decide which slot you want to use. I'm going to be using this slot over here because I have a little bit more space on this side. And this is going to be a little bit more limited, but you can use either side, it really doesn't matter. When I put my gauge inside the slot like this, my stock is going to be right here. My base is going to be about right here on the end of my miter gauge. I'll stick my piece in now, just going to fit right here on the edge, and I need to mark the inside of this. To attach this, you can see I've got these little ovals inside here, and I'm just going to draw a line around it on both sides. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut this out so that a hanger bolt will fit right inside of here. I could drill these out, but I'm going to make it easy on myself and just cut this on the table saw. So you'll need to find the right threaded size that will fit inside of your slot. Mine's 5/16. I think my other one is 1/4 of an inch. So you just need to really figure out what works best for your miter gauge. Now, if I measure this, it looks like I'm at the inside between the lines 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to go ahead and set my marking gauge to 1/4 of an inch. I'll go ahead and come in here now and set this for 1/4 of an inch and line this up with my blade and make my cuts. And attach it to the front. Now, when you clamp this up, it's crucial that these two faces are flush with each other. If they're not flush, you're going to have problems later on. You can let this dry, give it maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours. You want this to be really dry before adding those hanger bolts, but I'm actually gonna come in here and add some screws. To put the hanger bolt in, I'm gonna use 2 nuts. This comes from an old friend of mine. Put them together like this and then you just jam them. Once they're jammed together really good, you can turn it in. Very, very easy. To put this in here, it's very tight. To lock this down, I'm going to use a hex nut inside of a hex nut. It's really easy to make one. This is a 5/16 hex nut that's pushed into a 15/16 hex nut. And that just makes it a lot easier for me to tighten this down. It's all just a matter of pressing one nut inside of another, using one that's just slightly fits inside the other one. I've got my base attached to my miter gauge and we're ready for the next part. But first, let me show you how to make a miter gauge bar that will fit on the bottom of this if you choose not to use the miter gauge. To go this route, you're gonna need to have a runner that will fit inside of your miter slot. It can't have any side-to-side play or you're gonna have inaccurate cuts. That doesn't mean that you want to have it in so tight that you can't move it. Otherwise, you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on it, which can be very dangerous later on. So you just want to have something that just fits in there nice and smooth. It's going to give you a nice back and forth motion without having any play in it. You can go with solid wood, but I've always found that plywood is much more stable and it won't swell or contract as much as the solid wood. Once you've cut this to the right dimensions, we'll put this in the slot and then we need to place our base where you want it to be away from the blade. And again, that can be either this side or the other side. You're going to mark on your base the start of it right here like this. You really don't need to mark the other side at this time. Now, I'll add my sled, and I've raised my blade to 1/8 of an inch above the top of the sled. I'll add my piece now to the top, and I need to cut a slot out that will fit the miter bar that we made. Again, I'm only 1/8 inch above the top of the table saw sled because I do have my T-track that I've already cut down a little bit with, and I don't want to obviously cut too far into that. Once this fits in here really tight, I'm gonna go ahead and pull this out. And now I'm going to actually raise my blade and cut the edge of this off. And the reason that I'm doing this is that if there's any error with my table saw sled, it will also be included with my stock. This will effectively make sure that my miter slot is parallel to the end of my board. Once you've attached this and added glue, and probably should add some screws through the bottom, it should fit inside of your slot without any problems. I will note that when you use this, that you don't want to push on this side, otherwise it's not going to move. You'll want to push through right on top of the miter slot. With the miter gauge method, I attached the block on the back, and this is so that I could screw into it. I would still recommend attaching this, maybe rounding this edge off here. It'll give you something to push against. And I do have some extra things that you can do later on. We are now going to work on the fence. Because I do have a gap between my carriage and the base, I'm going to add a washer, put my knob back on, I'll tighten it down. I want to make sure I get it right to the edge, like that. Now I can put my piece of stock on here. You can use a speed square, I'm going to use a machine square, but I want to line this up like this. I'll use a knife on the back side of this, and this is a Kiradashi blade that I'm using, but really anything that's going to have a flat side to it, maybe even a chisel. And I just want to draw a line showing exactly where this stock meets up with the other stock. I'll take my blade here and I'm just going to set it inside the cut, place a straight edge next to it, and then finish it all the way to the edge. And now you can see that I've transferred that line all the way to the front. Now I'll set my blade to half the thickness of my plywood, or 3/8 of an inch. Move the fence over now and set the end of my blade on this side, right on the line. And now when we add this, it should slide right in without any problems. The support pieces that are going to hold the fence up need to be absolutely square on the corners. I've made sure that this one is, and what I need to do now is separate this in half. It really doesn't matter how you do it. You can use a bandsaw. Because I am trying to do this project by using just the table saw, I'm going to show you a little trick that you can use to cut this in half. First, I'm going to take a piece of double-sided tape. I'll peel this off. I've drawn a line on a piece of scrap wood. I'll put the point here inside of my cut down here, and then I'll put the other point right on that drawn line. With the scrap board, I'm just going to hold this down and push this through. That'll give me a nice cut. I've got both edges. This is exactly what I need right here. And now if I add this back and put my corners on, you can see exactly what I'm trying to achieve with this. But we're not quite done with the fence yet. After I've added my fence to the cradle, there's one problem we need to overcome, and that is that when I use this later on, I need something to support my stock. If I add a block like this, I'll easily have the support I need. If you're not worried about cutting into the back of the block, you can attach this with glue and you're done. But I'd like to make this so that I can move it up and down out of the way of the blade. To do that, I'm going to use a piece of scrap T-track. I added a couple extra holes to give it a little more attaching power. Now I need to cut a channel that will allow it to slide. I'll lower my blade so that it touches the top of the T-track. I'll find the approximate center now and use the cut, flip, cut technique to make sure I'm in the dead center of the stock. We want this to slide tight, so be sure to keep checking as you make your passes. I'll come in here now, I'll push this to one side, and then I want to find my most center hole. Okay, this is me in the future. I made a mistake by drilling a hole here. It should be in the center. And I'll drill this out at 1/4 of an inch so that it'll accept a T-bolt that's 1/4 inches in diameter. I've added some tape to my T-track because I don't want this to move around inside of the fence. I've got the whole side up, which is how it's going to be on the jig. I want the inside track to fit in like this, but I want to make sure that the tape side is going to be facing towards the blade. Now I can place this inside of the fence and it should fit in there pretty tight. I'm going to extend this just enough to then get the first hole through. I'll take the fence that this is going to attach to, and again, my slot is here. It's going to go against the jig on the back, and this piece will fit right on here like this. I'll slide this down. I want to make sure that I keep this flush. And now I can add a couple clamps to it to lock it in place. Now I've got both sides flush, and I need to go ahead and add a screw to that. I'll use a hinge countersink bit to drill my hole, and I want to extend that hole all the way through. Now we can use a number 6 by 3/4 of an inch and move it to the other side. So right there, and I'll go ahead and make sure that it's flush again with my tabletop. Now that we put this on, we'll go ahead and take it off. I've got my marking gauge here, and I'm just going to find the center of my plywood and I need to draw some lines. I'm gonna come down 1 3/8, and this is gonna be my first hole right here. And then from there, I'm gonna go 1.5 inches. So there, and then another 1.5 inches, which is gonna be right there. And I can quickly just go ahead and draw my intersecting points over here. Besides these points, we need to drill out the bottom side of this. Once again, I'll find the center of my 3/4 inch stock, and I'll draw a line on this side as well as on this side. I want to make an intersecting line at 1 inch on both sides, as well as at 3 inches. Because I'm using number 6 by 1.5 inches, I'll be using a 3/32 inch bit here. I'm going to countersink these, but I'm also going to flip this over and countersink the other side. And that's just a little tip to keep the backside from pressing into whatever you're screwing this into, which can give you gaps later on. I'll be honest with you, I've been dreading this part of the project the most because we want to make sure that everything lines up just right. If the fence is off, then we're going to have cuts that are off. So this all really needs to line up well. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a clamp. And that's actually pretty good right there. I don't want to hold this and try to drill it at the same time, so I'm going to try using super glue. I don't like super glue normally, but this stuff, this Loctite professional stuff, you can hold it in place for 10 seconds and it's locked in place. I'll just hold it here and hopefully everything lines up. That seems to have held pretty good. From what I see, it looks like it worked. Good. And we look really good. I've taken everything apart and it's time to epoxy the rods onto the top. I'm gonna take a marker and go right down the back of it because I still need to sand it just a little bit like that. I'll let it dry. So I'll come in here with a sanding block and I'll lightly sand it just along that line. Maybe I'll turn it a little bit. I'm doing it because these are zinc coated and I want to make sure that I get down to the bare metal just a little bit. This will also give the epoxy something to grab onto. With that done, I'll take a vinegar water solution, just half and half. I'm going to get my rag a little wet, find that rough side and just clean it up. That'll clean any kind of oil or any other dirt that's on the surface, as well as getting any of the dust off. I'll do equal parts epoxy now. Now I'll carefully spread this in the channel. I'll find the side with the scratches on it. I'll just place that straight down. Make sure that you clean up anything that might have gotten on the surface. I'm gonna go ahead and put my bolt back in here as well as the cradle. And I'm gonna make sure it's in the center and clamp down. We'll come back in a few hours after this is cured. Alternatively, you could use clamps. I think that this is probably a better method. It just makes sure that along the entire length, it's gonna be in the same spot. So it's up to you, but that's what I did. To make this, you're gonna need a couple of scraps of plywood, as well as some T-bolts, a 6D nail, and either some thumb nuts, or you can make some with 2 1/2-inch nuts and 2 1/4-inch nuts. Again, pressing or hammering these two together. The first thing that we need to do is cut our T-track to size, and you'll need about 8 inches altogether of this. I'm gonna come over right about there and just use these 2 screw holes in the middle like this. So that's probably about 8 inches right there. I'll quickly cut this off with a hacksaw now. With a T-track cut, I need to cut a slot in the back of this piece of plywood, this scrap of plywood here, that will fit, again, on the track. And this is just like the other track that I made for the fence on the fence. With this one, I'm only gonna be cutting in about 1/8 of an inch. And again, it needs to fit and slide a little tightly in here. We don't want it to have a lot of slop. Again, I've only raised the blade so that's about 1/8 of an inch off the top of the surface. And I'm gonna use one of my favorite techniques, which again is the flip cut flip method. I'm gonna find the approximate center here, and that looks like it's it right there. Maybe a little off, but that's okay because again, the cut flip method takes care of that. I did make this a little bit longer, and I did that because it's a little bit safer than trying to cut something that's really short, but I only need 2 inches off of this entire section here. So I'll go ahead now and cut this into 2 2-inch pieces. Now I can come in here with a 3/16 bit, and I'm just gonna find the approximate center of my block, and I'm gonna make a mark on it. Oh, and I will be drilling this out at 1/4 of an inch. Before we attach this on, I want to add my needle over here. So we're going to go ahead and cut this now, and we'll come back to this. We'll attach this in a little bit. I've raised my blade about 1/8 of an inch above the top of the surface again, and this piece is about 2 inches. So I also found the center of this, which is about 1 inch, and I'm going to move it in about this far, and then I'm going to pull it straight back. Now with this cut made, I'm going to come in here. I've got a mark at 1 inch. I'm just gonna carry that across, and now I need to draw an X here as well as over here. That way I can find my center. I'm gonna be using some number 8s. These are 1 inch. You might go up to 1 1/4 inches if you want to, but I'm gonna drill each of these holes out with an 1/8 inch drill bit. And now I can just go ahead and section this off right at that inch. Now really the best way to do this is to find a hole in your bench, or even just to take 2 pieces of wood and stack them up against each other. And I'm just gonna hammer this nail in, the 60 nail. That looks pretty good right there. Before I attach the T-track, I really wanna put my pointer on first. I wanna make sure that I've got it in the right spot, which I think is gonna be right there. I've got this pushed as far forward as this can go before it hits the blade. And I think that this is probably gonna be my best spot to add the pointer. From the pointer over, it looks like it's gonna be 2 3/4 of an inch. Before we do this, I do think it's probably a good idea to use a little bit of double-sided tape or carpet tape here. I don't want this to move around as I'm drilling or adding screws later on. To attach the T-track, I'm gonna slide this all the way over until it's just about touching the blade. So right about there. And I want to make sure that it's not obviously going to hit the blade. I've set my first block so that I can see the hole that I need to add a screw to. And this is going to come in here like this. I've got this placed right up next to the nail. I'll use a 3/16 bit again, and I'm just going to mark where I need to drill a hole out. I'll go ahead and move my second block over and add a mark on this side as well. I'll now drill these out at 3/32 of an inch since I will be using a number 6 by 1/2 inch screw. And finally, one thing that I want to add is a ruler to this. This is a steel ruler. I've got a magnet here. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to turn out later on, if this is going to be a good idea, but it's a magnet and I don't have to attach this permanently, but I'm going to place this right here. And the thing that I like about this is that I can move this around. Let's say if I want to move over just 1/8 of an inch, I can slide this 1/8 of an inch. To do that, I'm going to use a hinge bit here to drill my holes out, which is something I probably should have used with my other holes. I'm really not sure how beneficial this will be in the future, but it is a simple magnet that you can add on later on. You'll just need to make sure that you give yourself a little bit of space here if you do decide to do that later on. Because I don't want to cut into the fence, I'm going to make sure that I can't move my cradle any far forward than right here. I'll take a 3/32 inch bit, and I'm going to make sure that it's parallel to the side of the block. I'm going to drill a little hole. That looks pretty good right there. I can take this in. I think I'm going to cut the head of this off. That's it for this layer of the project. I have a couple more layers left before I show you how this works. If you decide that you don't want to go with the miter gauge and you'd rather just use the miter bar inside the miter slot, I'm going to show you how you can make a handle that will work with this setup. I've got a 4-inch block here. I've got a piece of cherry. I've got a carriage bolt, 5/16. I think this is 4 inches, and some extra hardware that will go with it. And again, this will all be on the website under the handle section. Before we do build this, it is important to note that we need to have a miter bar that's going to be about 4 inches longer than the entire jig. The first thing that I need to do is raise my blade to be the thickness that I cut the notch in my jig. So right about there. Now I'm going to find the approximate center. Again, it doesn't matter. And once again, I'm going to do the cut, flip, cut method. And I'll check each time to see if it fits on my miter bar. While I'm here, I'm gonna raise my blade so that's 5/32 off the top of the saw, and I'm gonna make my cuts until my 5/16 bolt fits inside. Since nobody likes square handles, I set my blade to an angle and cut the first edge. But the problem obviously comes when we try to cut the other edge. So I've got a piece of scrap here, and I'm going to hot glue this piece to it and run it through. With this edge cut, I'm going to place it against my fence and make another pass. Now I can break this piece off, and I'm going to flip it to the other side like this. And no matter the angle that you cut, they will line up on the edge. I'm going to add a little hot glue to this and attach it again. The important part of this is that we make sure that we get any hot glue that's on this side off. Once you're sure that this is smooth all the way across, we can make a cut on the other side to give us that final corner. And I actually made a mistake with this. I didn't cut this corner all the way across, so it actually sticks up, this piece, compared to the other one, as you can see. So I'm going to remove this, cut my corner all the way across, and then attach it. These two need to be on the same plane as the tabletop. And when I put the halves together, add the bolt, I've got a simple handle that feels really good in my hand. I can add a little bit of glue and put these together and then use my bolt as a spacer to make sure that they line up. I'll add a couple clamps for pressure and we'll put this aside for now. It'll be up to you where you want to put the handle. I think that in the dead center would probably work pretty good, but if you want it a little bit closer to the end here, you could do that as well. So I'm going to flip this over and I'll connect my diagonals. And I really only need to mark this inside cut that we made. Later on, a bolt will fit through this, so I need to cut the outside diameter of my bolt here, and I think this is 3/4 of an inch, as well as the through hole. I cut this down to its final size, which is 4 1/8 inches. I'll add my bolt through the bottom, add my handle, as well as a washer, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and put 1 hex nut on the top. We'll cinch that down really tight, and you can either use thread lock for this, or just add another nut to the top of it. We'll bring the jig to it now, and you'll need to attach this, add glue, but I would strongly recommend adding screws as well. And that's it. Very simple way to add a handle to this jig. I will note that you will always want to use both hands. You'll want your right hand on your stock, your left hand to push it through. To make the clamp, you only need a few things. I've got 2 knobs, a U-bolt, which is 5 inches long, a piece of hardboard, and a piece of plywood. You'll find everything in the clamp part on the website. What I'll first do is split this in half. I've marked my center and now I'm going to cut it. You'll need to have holes in your supports. Now I made this earlier, I'll show you how I did it. After I cut this out, I put all my pieces together, but I left the other side for us to do together. Because you don't have to do this before you put it together. We can still do this on the drill press. I've already marked this out on mine, but you're gonna wanna come in 1 5/8 from the bottom, and then you need to go half of a 5/16 drill bit, which is what you're gonna be using. So you're gonna go 5/32 away from the edge. And that should give you the exact center that you need to drill this out. The one problem that you could run into is this screw here on the side. If this won't fit underneath your drill press, you can always use a hand drill. Just make sure that you're really careful about drilling a straight hole. To stop any kind of tear out on the back, I clamped a block in. I'll go ahead now and add my screw back. And it looks like I cleared it pretty well. With these added, we need to find where our points are going to come together so that we can add holes. I'll come in here and just mark where the center is. I'll set my marking gauge to 5/8, and that will be my center. Now I'll drill these out at a 1/2 inch. The plywood piece needs to be the thickness of your fence here, as well as the length of the inside of your fence like this. We'll add wood glue, make sure it's clamped in tight, and add clamps to make sure it doesn't move. All you need to do is allow this to dry and you're done. The best joint to showcase this tenoning jig is the mortise open slot. It's perfect for demonstrating how easy it is to cut both parts of the joint. I'll start by cutting the shoulders. To find the width, I'll place the part of the joint I intend to cut between the fence and the blade. I'll use a table saw flip block stop so I can pivot it after lining up my stock. Next, I'll set a marking gauge on the cut so I know where to position the blade for the cheeks. I'll raise the blade to the height of the stock's width and clamp my board to the fence. Then I'll move the jig over until the blade sits on my mark and position the first piece of stock. If you're not using the stop system, you'll need to make a cut, flip the stock over, and make the second cut manually. I'll set the second stop for the other side of the tenon. Now I can make a cut, slide the jig back to the first stop, and make the final cut. To create the open mortise, I'll return to the stop system and use a strip of wood the same thickness as the blade. This will help adjust the inside cuts for both stops. I'll unlock the cradle, slide the strip between the nail and each stop, and then move the stop to meet the nail. Finally, I'll make my cuts to remove the wood. After the first cut, I'll slide the carriage over, make another cut, and continue this process until I reach the second stop. And when we go to put this together, we have a perfect fitting joint. Obviously, I couldn't use the clamp system with this or I would have cut into the U-bolts, but we can add a couple holes a little bit higher up that will get around this. If we measure from this edge 3 3/4 distance, put a mark here, and now we can use the clamp anytime we want in the future. I know this was a long video. I'd like to thank you for staying to the end. What do you think of this project? Is it something you'll make yourself? Leave me a comment below and let me know. Be sure to thank my patrons that keep all these plans absolutely free, and remember to keep making things.